Why Couples Grow Apart. Carl Jung. Carl Jung observed that the two people who stood at the altar are never the same two people who stand at the sink 20 years later, and he would say that this is not a tragedy, it is a law of the psyche doing exactly what it was always going to do. Here is the line I want to put in front of you, before anything else. Carl Jung wrote, "In each of us there is another whom we do not know," and he set that down in the 10th volume of his collected works. Sit with that for a moment. In each of us there is another whom we do not know, not just another hidden in your partner, another hidden in you. And Jung would stop you right there and say, do you see it? The person you married was never fully known even to themselves on the day you married them. So of course, a stranger surfaces at the breakfast table 20 years on. Of course, the voice on the phone sounds like someone you have not met. That is not decay. That is the unknown one finally stepping into the light. And the ache you feel when you look at someone you have loved for a decade and think, who are you now? That ache is not proof that love has failed. It is proof that love was never finished being made. So let me say plainly what I am doing this week. I am noticing the exact moment I stop looking at the person beside me and start looking at the picture I made of them years ago. I am asking myself honestly what part of my own psyche I have quietly handed to my partner to carry, so that I would not have to carry it myself. I am willing, even when it is uncomfortable, to meet the person across the table as a stranger again, rather than as a closed file of old history. Say it with me. I make the unconscious conscious. Again, I make the unconscious conscious. If this kind of clear seeing about the people we love matters to you, consider subscribing so that tomorrow's teaching has a way of finding you. And before we go any further, if something in what I just said landed somewhere quiet in you, type the two words "face it" in the comments below. Just those two words. Nothing more is required. Let it be a small private honesty between you and this screen. The first key is this. What you call growing apart usually began as a picture. In the earliest months of any real love, the two of you were not only relating to each other, you were relating to an image, a soul image, each of you carried, long before you ever met, formed out of every story you were told as a child about what love should feel like, every longing you never got to name, every hope you folded quietly into the shape of a future person, and for a while the actual human being in front of you fit that image well enough that you could not tell the two apart. You called it chemistry, you called it knowing right away, but what you were really feeling was the uncanny relief of an old inner picture finally finding a face to wear. That is not deception, that is simply how the psyche opens a door. But no living person can hold an inner picture forever. They breathe, they age, they have a bad week, they lose a job, they disagree with you about money at 11 at night, and the picture starts to slip, a little at first, then more. Imagine a woman who tells you her husband used to feel like the only person who had ever understood her completely. In the beginning, she could hand him an unfinished sentence, and he would somehow finish it exactly right. And now, 10 years in, she says he feels like a stranger who happens to know where the good silverware is kept, and she cannot pinpoint the day it changed. There was no single betrayal, no dramatic exit, only a slow erosion, a Tuesday here, a missed birthday there, a joke that used to land and now falls flat. She is not describing a marriage that broke. She is describing an image that finally wore through to the man underneath it. And here is the part most people never hear, that wearing through is not the failure of the love, it is the beginning of the only kind of love that can actually last. Because a picture cannot love you back. Only a person can. A picture never gets tired, never disagrees, never needs anything from you. A person does all three, and so the very qualities that make your partner exasperating on a Thursday evening are, strangely, the proof that you have finally stopped talking to a photograph and started living beside a human being. So when you feel yourselves growing apart in these early years, ask yourself gently what image you have been asking this person to keep performing. The endlessly patient one, the always put together one, the version of them that never needed anything from you. And ask whether you have ever really met the one standing in front of you at all, or only the understudy you cast in your own private story. growing apart, in this first and lightest sense, is not the marriage dying. It is the fantasy finishing its work and quietly stepping aside so that something truer has room to stand. And the couples who last are rarely the ones who kept the picture intact. They are the ones who let it crack and stayed anyway. I will not mourn the fantasy. I will meet the person. The second key is this. Not every distance between two people is caused by fading pictures. Some of it is caused by an asymmetry that was there from the very beginning and simply grows louder with time. Jung used a phrase for this that is worth holding carefully. He spoke of container and contained. One partner in almost every long relationship carries a slightly more complex inner life at any given moment. More questions, more restlessness, more hunger to understand what is happening inside them, while the other, for a season, rests more easily inside the relationship as it is. This has nothing to do with which partner is the man and which is the woman. It has to do with which psyche is doing more churning at that particular hour of that particular life. And here is the part almost nobody names out loud. This is not a flaw in either person. The one who churns is not more evolved. The one who rests easily is not shallow. They are simply standing in different weather that same week. Imagine a couple where one of them spends the drive home turning over a conversation from work for hours, wondering what it meant, wondering who they are becoming, while the other simply wants dinner and the television. For years, this difference can be almost invisible. Both of them get along fine. Breakfast happens, holidays happen, the ordinary machinery of a life together keeps turning. But slowly the one who churns starts to feel unaccompanied in their own depths, and the one who rests easily starts to feel vaguely accused of not being enough, simply for wanting an ordinary evening. And neither of them can quite name why the room between them has gotten larger. It is because the container has grown, and the contained has not moved at the same pace. Or the reverse happens later. Roles can and do trade over the years. The one who once wanted only dinner and television may wake at 50 with questions of their own, and the one who used to churn may finally grow quiet and content. This is not a life sentence. Containers and contained trade places more often than people admit, but if the shift goes unnoticed, it becomes one of the quietest ways couples drift, because nobody did anything wrong, nobody had an affair, nobody raised their voice. They simply stopped growing at matching speeds and never said so out loud. Walk through an ordinary week with me for a moment. Monday she comes home carrying a question about her own mother that has followed her all day, and he asks what is for dinner. Tuesday he mentions, almost in passing, that he has started wondering whether the job he has done for 20 years still means anything to him, and she is already thinking about the school pickup and does not quite hear it. Wednesday passes in silence about anything real. By Friday they have talked plenty, about logistics, about the children, about the leaking faucet, and not once about what either of them is actually carrying. Repeat that week 50 times a year for 10 years, and you do not get a broken marriage. You get two people standing an arm's length apart, who used to stand close enough to finish each other's sentences, and both of them will tell you honestly that nothing happened, and both of them will be right. Nothing happened. That is precisely the diagnosis. So here is the small practice worth trying this week. Notice once, just once, when your partner brings you something unfinished from inside themselves, a worry, a question, a private restlessness, and instead of answering with logistics, simply ask them to say more. That single question, tell me more, is often the whole difference between a container that keeps growing together and two containers that quietly grow apart. I will notice the pace of my own becoming and ask about hers. The third key is this, and it goes deeper than pace. It goes into pattern. And Jung taught that every long relationship eventually becomes the stage for what he called transference, meaning the old unfinished business of your childhood, the complexes formed around your mother or your father or the first person who ever failed to see you properly, gets quietly transferred onto the person nearest at hand, which is almost always your partner. And here is the piece most people never get told. A complex is not simply a memory. Jung described it as a splinter psyche, a small charged cluster of feeling and expectation that behaves almost like a second personality living inside you, mostly asleep, until something touches it, and then, for a few minutes or a few hours, it is not really you sitting at that table anymore. It is the complex, wearing your voice. Imagine a man who grew up with a mother who withdrew into silence whenever she was upset. So silence, to that little boy, meant danger, meant abandonment was coming. Now imagine that same man, 40 years old, married, and his wife goes quiet for an evening because she is simply tired, and something in him does not experience her as tired. Something in him experiences her as the withdrawing mother, and he reacts with a fear or an anger completely out of proportion to a tired evening. She has no idea what she triggered, because she did not trigger it. The old complex did. And now imagine her side of the very same evening. Her father was a man who criticized everything she brought home, every report card, every drawing. So any flicker of disapproval on a man's face still lands in her body like a verdict on her entire worth. So when he snaps at her silence, she does not hear a tired husband misreading a tired wife. She hears her father again, and now two splinter psyches are in the room, arguing with each other, while the two actual adults who love each other stand somewhere off to the side, watching it happen, half aware, unable to find the exit. This is what Jung meant when he wrote, in Ion, that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside, as fate. The unexamined childhood does not stay in childhood. It moves into the marriage and wears the face of your partner, and it does this so smoothly, so invisibly, that you will swear the argument was about the dishes, or the money, or the tone of voice, when the real argument, the one underneath, has nothing to do with tonight at all. And here is the honest and slightly frightening part. Jung also wrote, in his 16th volume, that if there is any real reaction between two people, both are transformed, meaning this transference is never one-sided for long. She reacts to his fear, he reacts to her reaction, she reacts to his reaction to her reaction, and slowly two people who started out simply loving each other are now locked in a dance. Neither of them designed, and neither of them can fully see the choreography of. Think of the argument you and your partner have had more times than you can count, the one that always seems to start over nothing and end in exhaustion. Notice that it rarely escalates in a straight line. Notice instead how quickly it goes from small to enormous. That speed is the signature of a complex being touched. An ordinary disagreement does not multiply itself in 90 seconds. Only an old wound does that. This is one of the deepest reasons couples grow apart. Not because the love left, but because two sets of old wounds started running the relationship, while both adults stood by, feeling the distance grow, and not knowing whose hand was actually on the wheel. And the tragedy is not that this happens, it happens in every long love there has ever been. The tragedy is only when it happens forever, without either of you turning to look at it directly, before you decide your partner has changed, or hardened, or stopped caring. Ask honestly whether the reaction in front of you belongs to this year or to some much older year. Ask whose face is actually being reenacted at your own kitchen table tonight. I will ask whose face I am actually seeing. The fourth key is this, and it is one people get wrong constantly. You may have heard the line that says, "You meet your destiny on the road you take to avoid it," and it gets attached to Jung's name in captions everywhere. That line belongs to the fabulist La Fontaine, not to Jung. And I bring this up because the same sloppiness happens inside marriages themselves. We hand our partner a line, a verdict, an old family myth about who they are, and we attribute it to them as if it were simply the truth of their character, rather than a story we are choosing to tell. Jung wrote once, in his memoirs, a small note about travel, that what irritates us in others can lead us to a better understanding of ourselves. It is a quiet observation, almost a throwaway line, but it holds the whole practice. What irritates you about your partner is rarely only about your partner, and the tell is always disproportion. Notice the size of the reaction against the size of the actual offense. A missed dentist appointment does not deserve an hour of cold silence. A wet towel on the floor does not deserve the tone of a courtroom. When the feeling is bigger than the fact, something else is speaking through the fact. Imagine a woman endlessly annoyed that her husband is disorganized, forgets appointments, leaves things half-finished, and she has built a whole verdict around it. He does not respect her time. He does not care. But if she is honest, the intensity of her irritation is out of proportion to a missed dentist appointment. Something in her is disowning her own disorganized side, the part of her that never gets to be careless because she works so hard to hold everything together, and she has quietly assigned that whole disowned piece of herself to him to carry. Now walk one ordinary day with me. Morning. He leaves his coffee cup on the counter, and something in her tightens more than a cup should ever cause. Noon. A text from him says he forgot to call the plumber, and the tightening becomes a small speech in her head about how he always does this. Evening. He comes home relaxed and unaware, and she greets him with an edge she cannot fully explain even to herself. None of this is really about the cup or the plumber. It is an old ledger being settled through him, and it runs in the other direction just as easily. Imagine a man irritated for years that his wife is too careful, too controlled, always 3 steps ahead, and underneath that irritation is his own buried longing to plan, to be taken seriously, to not be the one who always improvises because someone else always has. So try this here. Name one thing about your partner that irritates you more than the situation seems to warrant. Write it down plainly. Then ask yourself honestly where that same quality lives, buried and unlived, somewhere in you. Keep a small ledger of these moments across a week, not to blame yourself, only to see clearly, and watch how the ledger repeats. The same 3 or 4 irritations, circling back on different days wearing different clothes. That repetition is the signature of a projection, not a character flaw in your partner. Growing apart often means 2 people have quietly turned each other into screens, each one projecting an old story and calling it the other's character. And the strange mercy in this is that the work of taking it back is entirely yours to do. It does not require your partner to change even slightly. I will read my own reflection before I read a verdict onto her. And if this next part matters to you, consider staying close, because the deepest key is still ahead. One honest conversation a week can hold a marriage together longer than 1,000 assumptions. The 5th key is this, and it is the one I want you to actually sit with, because it holds all the others together. First, consider that individuation, the lifelong work of becoming who you actually are, underneath the roles you were handed, does not happen to a couple at the same time or at the same speed. One of you may enter what Jung called the afternoon of life years before the other does. One of you may wake up at 35 and realize the whole first half of your life was built on a program someone else wrote, a family expectation, a career chosen to please a parent, a self constructed to be loved rather than to be true. And the other partner is still comfortably living the morning program, still finding it perfectly workable. And there is nothing wrong with either state, but the gap between them, unspoken, becomes a canyon. Imagine a woman in her early 40s who suddenly cannot stand small talk at dinner parties anymore, who starts asking out loud what any of this is actually for, while her husband, content in his morning, wants only for things to stay as they comfortably are. She is not being difficult. She has simply begun the work Jung called coming to selfhood. And if he cannot join her there, or at minimum honor that she has begun the journey, the distance between them will not close on its own. And notice how this looks from his side too, because he is not standing still out of laziness. He built a good life on that morning program, a steady job, a paid-off house, a role he plays well, and now the person he built it all with is telling him, without quite saying it, that the building itself may need to change, and he has no map for that, so he does what most people do when the ground shifts. He holds the railing tighter. He asks her to just be happy with what they have, and she hears, in that request, a quiet demand that she go back to sleep. Second, consider that most marriages, quietly and without either partner choosing it, become what I would call a marriage of 2 personas rather than 2 people. You learn early which face keeps the peace at home, the agreeable one, the competent one, the endlessly patient one, and you wear that face at breakfast and at dinner and in bed, and so does your partner. And for years, Two masks live together quite peacefully, because masks do not actually disagree with each other. But underneath, the real person, the one with the unlived hungers and the private griefs, and the parts of the shadow that never get spoken, that person is going unmet night after night, and slowly, without either of you doing anything cruel, two masks maintaining a household starts to feel exactly like what it is, a competent arrangement between strangers. Let me walk you through what this actually looks like across one ordinary evening, because it is easy to miss while you are living inside it. At 6, the two of you arrive home within minutes of each other, and you ask, "How was your day?" And she says, "Fine." And you already know, fine is a mask word, a word that closes a door rather than opening one. But you do not push, because pushing is not what keeps the peace. At 7 you eat, and the conversation stays on the schedule. The children, the errands, the weather, all of it true, and none of it anywhere near what either of you is actually carrying that night. At 8:30, she goes quiet over the dishes, and something in her is turning over a fear she has not said out loud in months. Maybe a worry about her aging mother, maybe a private doubt about the shape her whole life has taken. And you are 2 rooms away, scrolling, resting, and neither of you calls across the distance. At 9, he mentions, almost as a joke, that work has felt pointless lately. And she laughs along because the mask does not know what else to do with a sentence like that. At 10, you lie down beside a person you have shared a bed with for a decade, and you say goodnight to the mask. And she says goodnight to the mask. And both of you fall asleep having spent an entire evening in the same house without ever actually finding each other. And here is the quiet cost of that. It is not one evening, it is thousands of evenings just like it, stacked one on top of the other for years, until neither of you can remember the last time you actually spoke as the unmasked person, rather than the household role. This is not a marriage in crisis. This is simply what unexamined masks do to an ordinary Tuesday. Third, consider what happens when a projection actually withdraws, because this is the moment that frightens people most, and it is also the moment Jung considered the true beginning of real relating. For years you loved a golden image. For years old wounds ran quiet transferences between you. For years 2 masks kept the peace. And then, often without warning, all 3 withdraw at once, and you look across the table and see, for perhaps the first time in a decade, an actual stranger, not the mother who withdrew, not the golden soul image, not the competent mask, an actual unknown person you agreed to spend your life with. This is terrifying, and it is also, Jung would insist, the only honest ground on which real intimacy can finally be built. Because you cannot truly love an image, and you cannot truly love a mask. You can only truly love a person, and you have just now, possibly for the first time, been given the chance to meet one. Fourth, consider that Jung wrote, "There is no birth of consciousness without pain," and he meant this quite literally about relationships. The growing apart you are grieving may in fact be labor, not decay. The pain of 2 masks cracking is indistinguishable from the inside, from the pain of a marriage actually ending, and this is precisely why so many couples flee at exactly the moment they are closest to something real. They mistake the birth pains for the death throes, and they leave the room just before the 2 of them might have actually met. Imagine a man who tells his friends, quite sincerely, that he and his wife have simply grown apart, that the spark is gone, that maybe this is just how long marriages end, and what he does not say, because he cannot quite see it himself, is that 3 months earlier she stopped performing the agreeable wife and started telling him things that unsettled him, small, true things. And instead of leaning toward that new honesty, he felt the old, comfortable distance and called it proof that the marriage was over, when it may have been the first sign, in years, that it was finally beginning. Fifth, consider that this labor rarely announces itself with any drama at all. It tends to arrive instead as a small, awkward, almost embarrassing impulse, the urge to say to the person across the table, "I do not think fine was true, what actually happened today?" And that single sentence, spoken instead of swallowed, is often the whole difference between a marriage that keeps drifting and one that begins, slowly and imperfectly, to actually meet, pause for a moment, and pick one real evening from this past week, and ask yourself honestly which mask you wore at dinner, and what you would have said instead if the mask had not been there. So I will ask you plainly, when you feel yourselves growing apart, before you conclude the love is over, ask whether what you are feeling is decay or labor. Ask whether an image is dying so a person can finally arrive. Ask whether tonight might be the night you say something truer than fine. I will let the mask crack rather than run from what stands beneath it. The sixth key is this, and it is the gentlest one. Growing apart is not a verdict. It is a report on where the tension currently stands between two people who are each still becoming someone. Jung taught that the greatest problems of a life are never solved outright. They are outgrown, and a marriage is very often the container in which that outgrowing happens for both of you at once, sometimes at different speeds, sometimes painfully out of step. Here is what that looks like on an ordinary Sunday, rather than in a theory. Imagine a couple who have been together long enough that the coffee gets made without asking, who move around the same kitchen like two people who already know exactly where the other one will be standing. And yet lately, there is a strange quiet at the table. Not a hostile quiet, just a quiet neither of them quite knows what to do with. She wonders, somewhere between the toast and the newspaper, whether this is simply what 30 years becomes, a comfortable arrangement with less to say, and he notices the same quiet and privately wonders if he has failed her somehow. Both of them are quietly grieving a love they assume has gone still, and neither has said a word about it out loud. Jung would ask you to slow down right here, because the quiet itself is not the diagnosis. What matters is which kind of quiet it is. The quiet of two people who have simply stopped reaching, or the quiet of two people who have finally run out of masks and pictures and old borrowed reactions to hide behind. Standing for once in plain, unguarded presence with each other, that second kind of quiet can feel, from the inside, almost identical to the first, which is exactly why so many long partnerships end at the very hour they were closest to something honest. Nobody ever taught either partner how to tell labor from decay, so consider a second ordinary moment. The same couple, months later, at an anniversary dinner they almost cancelled, because neither felt much like celebrating. And somewhere between the appetizer and the second glass of wine, one of them says, quietly, "I think we stopped talking about anything real a while back." And the other one, instead of defending or deflecting, simply says, "I know, I have felt it too," and nothing is solved in that moment. No plan is made, no promise extracted, and yet something shifts, because two people have just told each other the truth about a silence, instead of managing it politely. That single exchange, small as it looks from the outside, is the outgrowing Jung spoke of happening in real time. Not a dramatic reconciliation, only two people choosing honesty over comfortable distance for the length of one dinner. And here is the wider truth underneath both of these small scenes. Growing apart and growing together are not two separate roads a couple must choose between once and for all. They are two currents running through the very same marriage across many years, closer in one season, further in another. And the work was never to arrive at some permanent state of closeness and stay there forever. The work was only ever to keep noticing, honestly and without panic, which current you are in this month, and to say so out loud to the person standing beside you. So try this quietly this week. Notice one silence between you and your partner, just one, and instead of managing it, name it gently out loud. I will name the silence instead of managing it alone. Here is the whole picture. The early image you fell for was never the whole person, and its fading is not failure. One of you is very often carrying more inner weight than the other at any given season, and that asymmetry needs naming rather than silence. Old wounds from childhood quietly borrow your partner's face, and the reaction you feel most strongly may belong to an older year entirely. What irritates you most is frequently a mirror you have not yet turned around to look into properly. Underneath the individuation gap and the two personas keeping the peace, an actual unknown person has been waiting the whole time to finally be met, and the ache of growing apart, more often than the culture tells you, is labor rather than decay. All six of these were never six separate keys at all. They were 6 turns of one single key, the recognition that you were never actually promised a partner who stays the same. You were promised the chance to keep meeting, again and again, a person who is still becoming, exactly as you are. There is no ceremony needed to close a teaching like this, only a plain return to what began it. In each of us there is another, whom we do not know. And that is true of the one across your table tonight, and it has been true of you the whole time as well. Say it with me one final time. I make the unconscious conscious. And if you carry only one thing out of this fire tonight, let it be this. The distance you feel is not proof the love has ended. It may simply be proof that 2 people are still, somehow, after everything, growing